Now with the filters rendered here, of course it would be nice to have a save button here at the top that allows us to, well, save any changes to filters we made. So in the filters screen, we already have one header button on header left. I now also want to have one on header right, so on the right of my header. So header right here is basically the same as we have it here, so we can just copy this here because we want to have header buttons there with one button. That will be the save button, and the icon we can use there is, for example, and of course you can pick a different one, but here I will go with, for example, save. And now when this is pressed, however, that will be a bit tricky. Of course, we fire a function, we could console log saving filters here. Now the actual logic for saving and applying filters is something we'll take care about in the next module, but still there is some issue with that. If I save it like this and we go to the filters, of course we can press this works. But what would be nice is that we then really gather our current state of filters, so basically get a snapshot of our current state here, and for the moment log this to the console. In the next module, apply this somehow to filter the recipes we're showing on the other screens. Now this might sound trivial, but we'll have a problem here. Our filters, so the information which filters are set, that's all stored in these state variables here, right? And that's part of our component. Our button, however, is in the navigation options. And yes, there we get this nav data, which for example gives us the navigation prop in the end. But what we don't have here is access to the state of our component, and that is what I need here though. And now this here is really an important pattern which might look like a strange hack or workaround, but which is the way of actually communicating between your navigation options and your component if you depend on changing data in your component inside of your navigation options. So in the navigation options, you need information about data that changed in your component. This is also an approach you find in the official docs of React Navigation, by the way. We can use params, so that thing we passed between screens, to communicate between our component and the navigation options. And this might sound strange, but this is exactly what we'll do now. Let's say here in our component we add a new function, and I'll name this function here save filters. You can name it however you want. It's a function that takes no arguments, but that has one job. It will create a applied filters constant, for example, which is an object which gathers our filters. So there we could have gluten-free as a key, and we store is gluten-free as a value. We have lactose-free as a key, and we store our current is lactose-free state value. We do the same for vegan with is vegan, and we do the same for is vegetarian and is vegetarian, like that. And thereafter I will console log this applied filters thing. Now the thing is, I would like to give access to this function, which is part of my component, to my navigation options, so that I can trigger this function from inside the navigation options. And for this we can use params. Let's add useEffect so that we have a way of executing code whenever our state changes, because that's when I want to forward this updated function, which basically captures my current state, to my navigation options. So here I can add useEffect, and useEffect takes a function which runs whenever our state changed and whenever the component re-rendered. And in there we can now use props navigation set params. We haven't used set params before, we only worked with get param. We didn't use set params because before we only set params when we navigated to a new screen. Then, for example, as in the categories screen, we passed our params like this to the new screen. But we can use set params to update the params values for the currently loaded screen. Now here on this screen we got no params, so it's empty. Hence we can set params to a brand new object here, and I want to add one entry there, but you could add as many as you want. I want to add a save key, and you can take any name for that key which you want, and point at save filters. So at this function, I don't execute the function, I don't add parentheses, I just point at it. I just use this variable, which holds a pointer at this function in the end, and forward this value, so forward this pointer or store this pointer to that function in that save key, in that object, which I now set as params in this screen, in the filters screen. This allows us to go to the navigation options, and there we have access to nav data and therefore to navigation, right? And that means that here, for the save button, when pressing this, we can actually use navdata.navigation get param. That is how we can retrieve a parameter, and that's available here in the navigation options too, save. And I can retrieve that save parameter, which I'm setting here in useEffect. And I know this is super strange the first time you see this, and it looks like a really dirty hack, but it is not. This is a valid way of communicating between your component and your navigation options, which you typically need when having action items in your navigation options. This will get us access to our parameters, and there we access the save parameter. The save parameter will be this function, and we update the value in that parameter whenever our state changes. And we need to do this because in this function, this is recreated whenever our state changes, and it locks in the latest state values, and that's of course what we want when this function gets executed eventually with the help of params through that button in the navigation options. So we use params as a way of communicating between our component and the navigation options. Kind of a workaround, but indeed the one you find in the official docs as well, and the way of how you communicate here. Now, before we save this, there are two things we need to do though. UseEffect right now runs whenever this component updates. In the end, it should only run when save filters holds a new value. So I'll add this second argument to UseEffect, which is this array of dependencies, and there save filters. So this variable here, which holds a function, is a dependency. And right now, this will always rebuild when the component rebuilds. So it's not really a dependency that helps us, but we'll soon fix this. And props also is a dependency. Now, actually, to avoid unnecessary re-renders whenever anything in the parent component changes, I'll use a different way of extracting my navigation prop. I'll use destructuring here, like this, navigation equals props. This is a syntax which uses object destructuring, which means props is an object, and this pulls out the navigation key and stores it in a brand new constant of the same name, so of the same navigation. It stores the value in the navigation prop in that navigation constant now. That's what this syntax does. And the advantage is that we now have a navigation constant here, which we can use in UseEffect without props, because we have this stored in a separate constant now. And now we can add this as a dependency, which means when this changes, this will rebuild. But if anything else in the props changes, this will not unnecessarily rerun the effect. Now, to make sure that save filters only updates when our state changes, we can import the useCallback hook from React, another hook built into React. And this allows us to wrap a function so that this function is actually cached by React and is only recreated if its dependencies changed. We wrap this around our save filters functions just like this. So we pass this function as an argument to useCallback. And useCallback also takes a second argument, which is an array of dependencies. And there we need to specify all the dependencies we have here that could change and that would lead us to, well, recreate that function. And that essentially is the case if one of the four states here changes. So is gluten-free, is lactose-free, is vegan, and is vegetarian are now all dependencies of useCallback, and that means this component function here will be recreated if any of these states here changes. If anything else causes this component to re-render, will not recreate this function. And that's in turn important because that save filters function is a dependency of UseEffect. So if that is recreated, UseEffect runs again, which updates our params. And we want to keep this to a minimum and not constantly update our params, but really only do that if we need to do it. With this in place, we should now be able to press the save button and see the filters we chose. So let's go, to filters here. and now this breaks. Do you have any idea why it would break? The problem is, I have navigation here as a dependency in useEffect, and I explained why I have it, right? That I don't want to have props in its entirety and so on. A problem just is, when we call set params, we add new params to our navigator in the end, and what this also does is it causes navigation to change. So in the end I have an infinite loop here. If I remove navigation here as a dependency, then this will work. If we now save this, and now if you close both apps here with the help of the task managers and you then restart that on both operating systems, you'll see that now this indeed works and you can hit save here. Though what you'll not see is the output in the log here. That, however, makes a lot of sense, because if you have a closer look at the save button in our header, then what I'm doing here in onPress is I'm in the end executing this function, but what does this do? It retrieves our parameters saved in the, or stored in the save key. What is this? Well, that is, as mentioned before, a pointer at the save filters function. So we retrieve that pointer. If we then don't do anything with that pointer, we're, well, not doing anything. That is a pointer at a function, so of course we need to execute it, like this, by adding parentheses. Alternatively, we simply get rid of this anonymous arrow function here, and we simply bind onPress to the result of retrieving our pointer here like that, because then this pointer at the function will be executed for us when we press this. That's the alternative. So now if we save this, and we therefore let this reload, we go back to the filters. If I hit save here, we now see output in the log. If I scroll up a bit here, everything's set to false. If I now set lactose-free and vegetarian to true and I hit save, we see another log, and there indeed vegetarian and lactose-free is set to true, which is exactly what I have here. So now that is working. Let's confirm that it also works on Android by going to filters there as well. Let's set lactose-free to true and save this. And if we do so, that's our Android output here. Lactose-free is true, everything else is false, so now this also works. So this workaround can be a bit tricky to wrap your head around, and avoiding this infinite loop here also is important, making sure that you use callback here to avoid unnecessary rebuilds of this function here also is something you should do, so that when you update the params and therefore this component rebuilds, you don't also rebuild that function and therefore also enter an infinite loop. But with that, we have a way of communicating between component and navigation options, which is typically a pattern you need when you have action items in your action bar and you want to trigger something that depends on data managed in your component with the help of these buttons.